Welcome back once again to Global FinTech Fest, organized by FinTech Convergence Council of IAMEI and National Payments Corporation of India, presented by Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, and Reserve Bank of India, powered by Amazon Pay and brought to you by WhatsApp and Google Pay. Our next session is a trialogue on social transfer benefits in the time of COVID. We welcome our moderator, Mr. Harish Natarajan, Lead Financial Sector Specialist, World Bank Group, followed by our esteemed panelists, Mr. Alan Gelb, Senior Fellow, Center for Global Development, and Mr. Rodrigo Asamsao, former President, DataPrev. Welcome, everyone. Over to you, Mr. Natarajan.
Thank you, Javisha. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you, depending on where you are connected from. My name is Harish Natarajan. As Javisha introduced, I'm from the World Bank. I focus on payments and market infrastructure topics. The topic for discussion today is about social benefit transfers and the applications of technology. Just a little bit of background on why we chose this particular topic. Social protection payments are a critical part of the social safety nets in many countries, and in some sense, they're part of the social contract. And it has become even more important due to the COVID-19 context as the economic downturn and lockdowns have expanded the number of individuals and businesses who need some form of government support and assistance. And as per our estimate, in the last 3-4 months, about 657 million people globally were brought into the social safety nets as part of the expansion of these programs across the World Bank client countries, which includes most of the emerging markets and developing economies. And the scale-up has meant reimagining the whole process for identifying who needs help, who needs to be paid, onboarding them onto the different systems, including opening accounts for people who do not have existing accounts, and then also expanding the acceptance network where the individuals can go and access their accounts and make use of them. And each of them has a technology element. And very often, when we talk about technology in the space, we primarily refer to the digital payment side. And the attempt in this session would be to shine some light on other areas of the process where technology is applied. So with that background, let me request the first panelist, Alan Gell, to take us through some specific perspectives here. And I would, in particular, request him to cover the social protection value chain and where the technology is being adopted, and then also how different countries have handled the challenge and what differences are we seeing, and to also have a little bit of forward look and to see how countries can better prepare for future crises. So Alan, over to you, and I will kind of start with the slideshow.
Thank you very much, Harish, and thank you for the opportunity to be at this wonderful conference. What I'd like to do is to run through a short summary with you of how digital technology is being used in the expansion of social protection in response to COVID. This picture shows the countries and the number of measures which have been put in place since the start of the pandemic. And according to the World Bank, they're about covering 195 countries. There are more than 1,000 measures, separate measures that have been put in place to help provide social protection to the population. And this is almost certainly an underestimate because these numbers don't capture every country and every measure, but it gives you some idea of how amazing the response has been. Next slide, please. Now, the technology is being used at all stages in the value chain, the social transfer value chain, which comprises the systems to develop to deliver social protection. You have to inform the potential beneficiaries that there are programs there. You have to manage the applications. You have to identify them. Who are these people? You have to screen them against various criteria and select those who are going to be paid. These have to be onboarded into the program. Then there have to be arrangements for payments. And then there have to be arrangements for monitoring the performance and feeding back. And one of the big challenges for COVID relief is to scale up the existing systems and identify the new poor, the people who were not previously covered by the systems but have to be covered now. So this is a very, very big challenge. Moving on. When we look at the use of digital, we have to look at the infrastructure and the architecture. And here are 4 dimensions which are turning out to be very important. And one is coverage of ID systems, of mobile communications, and of payment systems. And together, of course, in India, these are known as the JAM. And we're using this term much more generally in a global sense, actually. India has led the way in giving a name to this group of digital technologies. And the coverage across the population is very important. Plus, data and data integration. The coverage of social registers, the existing social registers in the country. The linkages between the JAM and the social registers. The linkages across social registers, usually through something like a national ID number. And the linkages with other data, which we call lifestyle data. These could be records of assets, they could be records of car ownership, they could be all sorts of things. They could also be digital data. And these together, these 4 dimensions are turning out to be very important in shaping what countries are able to do. Now, countries are actually quite different. And we have done in our work comparisons across countries of how they score on a JAM index. Usually, low-income countries have lower coverage of IDs, mobiles, and payment systems, and lower levels of data integration. A country like India has a very high JAM index, right? And high linkage with social programs. But there's low integration across benefit programs because many are implemented by states. South Africa, another comparison, has high JAM and high integration through the national ID. A country like Pakistan only has moderate levels of JAM, but high linkage through the national ID. So countries differ. Let's move on to examples. What has happened, these measures, these 1,000 plus measures, they have firstly increased benefits under existing programs. They have expanded access to existing programs. And most interesting for us, new programs have been created to reach what we call the new poor, the people who are not part of the formal economy and who are not covered by social protection in the past. So, many countries have launched these programs, including Namibia, Togo, South Africa, Pakistan. India has launched programs, for example, the payment to the female Jandan account holders. Bangladesh has launched support for garment workers. Countries have also, another measure, tried to expand digital payments to reduce the use of cash. And Rwanda, Kenya, for example, have reduced charges on digital payments. And these systems have played a critical role in scaling up. So let me move to along the value chain. First of all, we find that digital campaigns are very successful in mobilizing beneficiaries through mobiles, through WhatsApps, through websites. In Namibia, for example, almost 1 million applications for assistance from a population of only 2.4 million, right? So this is quite an effective use of digital mechanisms. What about the screening of applications and onboarding them? Most countries are screening these for uniqueness through linkage to a national ID and for formal employment. In other words, are they actually employed in the formal sector and getting unemployment benefits, or are they already receiving social benefits? This is to identify the missing middle. Screening for poverty through social registers and possibly lifetime data. And this screening is resulting in a massive saving of resources. Typically, about half of the applications from these countries have been rejected and only half have been accepted. But digital has some limits. The data are often not accurate. Sometimes the systems are low quality. And we see various forms of digital exclusion, right? And we see trade-offs. between the rigor, the inclusion, and the speed. Next, digital payments. These are playing a very critical role despite limitations. Payments are being routed through bank accounts, mobile money, or e-wallets, and this is triggering innovations in the payment systems. We see these systems, these can be very, very fast. Namibia basically had a 3-week program with 98% payout of e-wallets. Quite remarkable. And some countries like Togo, which has also launched such a program, have used this to encourage financial inclusion, to link people up with mobile money or bank accounts. Limitations, prevalence of cash out. There is still crowding at pay points and the need to phase payments. Sometimes liquidity management is an issue, and sometimes there is stress on the payment systems. The payment systems, for example, the Aadhaar-enabled payment system in India has been under some stress because of the increased transactions. So we see those kind of issues. And we also see that low fees can encourage digital payments. In Rwanda, when they abolished charges, they found that digital payments increased almost 5 times. But this raises a question about the sustainability of the agent network. Couple of cautions here. Digital doesn't do it all. Human backup is essential. There are many examples of problems in accessing digital systems. Sometimes women who have less access to mobiles. Some are falling through the cracks in the systems, especially when they are separate systems implemented by subnational governments. And there will be disputes, especially with rapid implementation. In South Africa, for example, about 30% of the applications for emergency relief were denied based on faulty unemployment records. And then that was reversed. So this is important. And finally, I would say integration, data integration facilitates coherence, but it raises privacy concerns. For example, in Turkey, the applications are being screened against at least 28 different databases, covering all sorts of things like registration, details, and others. Quite effective in screening, but raising questions about privacy. And looking ahead, we can see this becoming more of an issue as the digital footprints of people increase, right? So that is an issue. Let me move to a few conclusions finally, since time is drawing near. We see that digital technology is playing a huge role in scaling up protection across all the stages of the value chain. And it's not a complete solution. We mustn't look at it as a solution, but it can handle most cases, and therefore it leaves much fewer for costly human follow-up. And this is the way we should be looking at it, right? There are some major shortcomings that the COVID pandemic has exposed. One is in coverage and access to the JAM, to IDs, to mobiles, and to payment systems, right? Another is the coverage of social registries. And a third is the modernization of data systems to allow integration across the programs. And COVID is going to provide a huge boost to the digital capabilities in these areas. Finally, countries can draw on the experience with COVID to put in place better systems. And some of the innovations and the programs that we're seeing today will carry over to the post-COVID period. In terms of innovations, it's the ones for digital delivery, I believe, that will expand. In terms of programs, for example, in South Africa, the COVID grant is mutating into a permanent universal income grant, covering people who do not have other sources of income. But finally, for countries that do not have these digital underpinnings, they will require sustained investment in digital systems. There is no shortcut to that. The countries that have these capabilities are benefiting from years and years of investment in digital systems. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Let me now pass it on to Rodrigo. Rodrigo, I would request you to cover a few specific areas, specifically related to the Brazil's social protection program, which is one of the largest and the longest running programs in the world. And how has it fared during the COVID crisis? What are the lessons the rest of the world can learn from the Brazilian experience? And then also, given your role in the technology aspects of social protection program, how can you? What are your views on the evolution of the technology stack for Brazil and what are the focus areas going forward. So Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank for the invitation. Well, the social protection response to COVID-19 starts off or concentrates mostly in this emergency benefit that I'm going to be talking about. There are other aspects as unemployment benefits, and there are other aspects such as trying to keep enterprises from going under. But I'm going to focus on the emergency benefit because it has reached an unprecedented scale in Brazil. So it was established to protect informal and unprotected workers. It was decided that it would be available for people who are above 18 years of age, that were not formally employed, that were not receiving any other social benefit, with a monthly income of under half the minimum wage. The minimum wage at Brazil is slightly less than $200 at the moment. And that did not receive in 2018, which was the last full year that we had on record, a taxable income above 28,500 Brazilian reais, which basically means a yearly income of a bit over 5,000 US dollars. This legislation passed in the end of March, and the first payments 20 days after. So that was the time Brazil needed to organize itself. In fact, it could have been shorter, and I will get into some of the details why it wasn't. Initially, the decision was that free monthly transfers would be paid of around 600 reais, $112, and now it's been extended to 5 payments, and in the middle of these payments. This could be paid to a maximum of 2 eligible adults per household. And this is quite important because it increased the benefits available in the previous conditional cash transfer program, the Bolsa Familia, which is quite known around the world. And that explains a lot of the increase of the numbers. And now we have, as Alan said, we're starting the discussion on increasing the number of payments and perhaps keep it ongoing. So the data context is quite interesting because, as I mentioned, Bolsa Familia, or large, well-established CCT program, started in 2004, and it is currently reaching 13 million families and nearly 44 million people. Brazil is a large country. We have 207 million people, and usually we talk about millions this, millions that, and usually your numbers are huge. I have learned in the past, however, that when I'm talking to an Indian audience, these means very little, and I should be quite humbled here because the numbers are not the same when we're dealing with India. So Cadê Único, which is the social protection database that targets the poor and the extremely poor, has over 70 million registries. And this was built since 2004, and it's a very effective database registry. And that is one of the key elements that allowed us to define who was going to be reached by this new benefit. And the social information database is composed of several decades-old databases with most social protection and social security data. I'm going to be discussing a little bit further the integration and the cross-checking amongst this database. And also for the benefit, the second largest state bank, the Caixa Econômica Federal, which is the one responsible for the payments, established and adapted an app for registration and an app for payments that were adapted for the emergency benefit. And it was the main entry point for the missing middle. So the numbers were basically gathered from the beneficiaries of Bolsa Familia, the ones who were already in the Cadê Único that were not receiving the benefits, and applicants that came in through this app or the website. As you can see, the numbers are quite large as well, 107 million downloads for the registration app and 176 million downloads for the payment app, both produced by Caixa. And after we started, there was a huge influx of demands and contestations and complaints that resulted, of course, with the doubts as well, over 386 million calls in the call center that was established to receive this influx of communication. So these are the latest numbers. These are the numbers that were released yesterday, that the group composed by the Bolsa Familia beneficiaries were found 19 million individual persons that were eligible for this. This resulted now in over 57 million payments with 45 billion Brazilian reais. The ones in Cadastro Único, which were not the ones received, not the ones already contemplated in the Bolsa Familia benefit, added another 10.5 million people with 31 million payments and 20.6 billion reais. And the ones that enrolled through the application and the site were found 36.4 million eligible people. And the payments were 84 million with 55 billion. So at the moment, we are paying more than 66 individual emergency benefits, 173 payments, 121 billion reais, which roughly exchanges for 22.7 billion US dollars. This is calculated to have reached 124.2 million people. Again, I repeat, out of a population of 207. So in these 3 months since we've started, we have reached well beyond half of the Brazilian population. There were 109 million claims processed that resulted in 66 million approved eligible. And the error and fraud, which has started to come out, we're very happy to see that it's less than 1% of the beneficiaries. Of course, the news only talks about these frauds and the error, but statistically, the number is extremely encouraging. Please. So, who does what in this emergency benefit? Dataprev, the public ICT company that I used to be the CEO of, is involved heavily with the payment of Social Security benefits. So it's a company that is already geared to pay 40.8 million Social Security benefits through the banking systems. It processes the payroll, and over 30.4 million unemployment benefits paid last year. And it processes payments that corresponds to 8.4% of Brazil's GDP. So it is a huge influx of money that goes through this data processing company. It's a very large, very capable in terms of IT, as Alan mentioned. It was built in over 50 years. So for COVID-19, it processes all the claims and it cross-checks with 20 other databases. Caixa Econômica Federal is the third largest bank in Brazil, a public bank, has opened over 40 million digital savings accounts and launched the payment app to deal with the COVID in order to not only receive the applications, but also facilitate the payments. It receives the data through the apps and execute the payments. And the Ministry of Citizenship is responsible for Bolsa Familia, the CCT program that I mentioned, and it defines both the policy and validates the beneficiary list. Now, what happens is that there are over 20 databases that are cross-checked against each other in a constantly evolving data lake. Dataprev established a huge data lake with big data capability that crosses the individual tax registry numbers, the income tax, the list of employers, the list of employees, the remuneration that is declared every month for Social Security purposes, the voluntary Social Security contributions made by individuals, the special insured benefit the micro individual entrepreneurs, social benefits, unemployment benefits, the list of public employees at the federal and the state and municipal levels, the death registration system, the civil registration system, the database concerning prisoners, people within the prison system, politically exposed individuals that have some kind of political job or are related to politicians, the elected officials, the Cad Único that I mentioned, the Bolsa Familia beneficiaries, the military, and as well as Brazilian abroad. This started at a much smaller and less up-to-date rate, and it was constantly updated and added in order to solve some of the problems. There's an ongoing focus on data quality, on controlling the payment process, and enhancing this interface as an enabler of social protection. So we are looking at establishing this capacity in order to be prepared for the next discussion, for the next steps, which Alan mentioned at the end of his presentation. The observations I have is that the average benefit of the poorest that were happening before in Bolsa Familia is now 6 times higher than before. So this had a major increase in the outreach for the poor and the extreme poor. New technologies helped speed up this process, but as mentioned, can be quite exclusionary. The measures on social distancing were quite insufficient, and we had a lot of agglomerations at the cash withdrawal point. So that was a major point of attention that we really needed to improve. There were no initial provision for grievance claims, and these complaints and the whole structure to deal with them had to be corrected en route. There was at the beginning a political dispute between Dataprev and the major actors involved in terms of data processing versus payments, which actually delayed, as I mentioned, the start of the processing, and processing that could have happened in one day if we had taken the advantage of receiving the data properly. That didn't happen. The bank insisted that it would be the entry point in order to, have political credibility and benefit from this, and it actually harmed the data processing. But we managed to talk for the first time in Brazil, the non-poor, the informal, the self-employed, the vulnerable, that was previously out of the Bolsa Familia registry, this dealing with the missing middle. And of course, with these volumes and these numbers, this has already become the axis of a significant political dispute on who is the father of the benefit. And I would like to end by saying that we need to establish innovation process for the digital journey, as Alan mentioned, because we are, through our work at this moment, we're bringing about the digital ecosystem that we will inhabit from now on. And we have to always remember that we are preparing our data for systems and processes that are still to be created. This pandemic is the beginning of a series of natural catastrophes that we're going to be dealing with for the next 10 to 20 years at the least. And if we have the data infrastructure to be able to deal with this, we'll be in a much better position to face these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And I'll leave this slide on because I think it is very, it sums up the discussions very well, and it is very forward-looking and inspirational. I see a couple of questions have come in from the participants, so let me quickly pose them. First is a question about what are the regulatory changes which will enable this whole development of the G2B ecosystem, and what can be done, how quickly, and what is the kind of impact. So that's the question. The second question is, why do countries with advanced G2P payment systems are able to move things much faster? So I think it is, the question is perhaps asking, is that perhaps just sufficient to have just the G2P payment system, or is it things beyond that? So maybe, Alan, do you want to take a pass at these two questions, and then I will request Rodrigo also to come in?
Okay, thank you very much. Just briefly, on the second question, the sufficiency of G2P payment systems, I think we have to distinguish between the individual payment systems, in other words, a particular program and the ability to make that, and the ability to link across a range of information and systems to enable a coherent response. Many countries have established G2P payment systems for individual programs, and these often have their own arrangements and their own data systems and their own payment systems. But what we're seeing here, in order to get a coordinated national response, is the question of being able to link across a very wide range of data. And I think that that is turning out to be quite important in terms of how countries are able to respond to this kind of crisis. And I think you've seen a very good example in the case of Brazil of the kinds of measures that they're able to implement and that they're taking forward in order to do this. So the integration dimension is important. On regulatory changes, I think this depends, country by country. In some countries, they will benefit from regulatory changes to expand the reach of the jam. Conditions, for example, on mobile banking, on some countries do not allow this, and it reduces the ability of the financial system to extend to poor people. Mechanisms of spectrum auctions to encourage mobile connectivity, those kind of things. But then there are the whole range of regulatory issues associated with data, the ability to share data, the constraints on data, who manages data, and the requirements to preserve data privacy in a system where, the linkages that Rodrigo has talked about, we can see where that can go in terms of providing a real-time picture of individuals. So there are a range of issues here coming up in terms of the digital architecture that will have to be addressed.
Thank you, Alan. Rodrigo, do you want to supplement? Rodrigo?
Are you listening?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I would like to say a couple of things. The metaphor I usually use is that the same way that we dealt with, building ports in the 16th through the 18th century, and then railroads in the 19th century, and then roadways and telecommunication lines. Now, one of the fundamental national infrastructures and even an international infrastructure we must deal with is the data infrastructure. And I think that, having just G2P payments is certainly not enough. Society nowadays needs to address its national data infrastructure. It goes from the identity schemes that were mentioned to its geographical database, to the database between all the social relations, the establishment of familial relationships. All these things are crucial for a modern society to function. If we don't build this properly, if we don't maintain this properly, and if we don't build them in a way, that it has to connect, it's like railroad gauges in the 19th century. If you don't have the same gauge, you will not cross between the different lines. If you don't have the ability to structure your data to be interconnected, it will not happen by itself. And as Alan mentioned, I do agree, the data regulation is crucial because the privacy concerns which are very present are only technically feasible if you design for privacy right from the start. It is not something that regulation will come afterwards and close the doors that technology have opened if you do not structure it with privacy by design. So you have to discuss it from the ground up and then establish your journey.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Just to add one perspective from my side, one specific area we are seeing quite a bit of regulatory changes in the emergency context is around the KYC requirements related to opening accounts in the financial sector. And there have been quite a few countries which have relaxed the requirements. Fortunately, around the same time, the FATF also came out with digital ID guidelines, and that has also been used by many countries. So we have about 5 minutes, so let me try and get to another dimension. On the topic of technology, since this is a conference focused on technology, there's been quite a bit of talk about applications of AI, machine learning in some of the earlier parts of the value chain on the GTP side in terms of targeting and matching towards different data sources. So how effective are these? Do you have any practical perspective on that? And then maybe if you have time to also maybe cover this is an area where there's quite a bit of bespoke development of IT systems. I think presumably data prep kind of developed most of the systems in-house and over a period of time. So is there a time now to start looking at open source technologies for some of the common issues on the GTP value chain and then also other related applications? So these are the two questions. Maybe let me pass it to you, Rodrigo, first and then to Alan. In maybe 2 minutes, please.
Okay, well, start with the second one. I think the whole idea of closed, licensed applications that are not open sourced are very non-conducive to these discussions that I mentioned. That structuring your data infrastructure. But of course, that does not mean at all that the price of the IT industry is going to diminish. I think the business model, the licensing business model, is rapidly being overcome, and we are seeing much more a gear towards software as a service, infrastructure as a service, where the whole discussion goes in a different direction. So I think the open source is definitely where we're going to be arriving at. We are already arriving at that. In the other element that you mentioned, the question here is that machine learning and AI, it learns. And what I mean is it can learn our prejudices, it can learn our limitations, it can enhance the exclusion, it can create very easily, if we're not extremely aware of this discussion, a digital dystopia. Instead of enhancing our capacity to improve conditions, it will do the exact opposite. The literature nowadays and the news is covered with examples of where mistakes are being made in this direction. If you are an optimistic person, you will think this is a learning curve and we will get to a better position. The only thing I have to say to close my remarks is in science fiction, usually the dystopia is much more interesting than the utopia. Probably because it's probably more probable and we believe it's going to happen easier than the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Alan, if you can kind of share your thoughts on any one of the questions or both of them in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, well, thank you. You know, I very much agree with Rodrigo. I think he's expressed it in some ways much better than I could possibly do. In terms of the open source, I think that some of these technologies are being evolved from being custom, innovative startup towards more commodity industries. And to give one example, we're seeing this in the area of digital identification, where there's a long tradition of closed source procurement, but that is now being changed with at least 2 initiatives. One is Indian initiative, MOSIP, which is an open source initiative to enable countries to take control over their own ID technology. And another is an open standards initiative, which has been launched by major players in the ID industry. So I think you're going to have both open source and open standards, where what you're really trying to do is to facilitate plug and play systems, where the countries, for example, will have a choice as to move providers in and out. On the
Alan, I think we are short of time, so I think we'll have to perhaps leave it there.
Okay.
Let me just add one concluding remark to say that the purpose behind organizing the session from my side was to draw the attention of fintech companies and the financial sector to this pressing public policy topic, and which is getting a lot of attention from public authorities at this point. So I hope we succeeded in that. And thank you, Alan and Rodrigo, for a very engaging discussion. So let me pass it back to the host.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear panelists, for being with us today and sharing some global insights with us. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a short 10-minute break before we move into the final session for today. Thank you.